Thanks for the opportunity to talk about MHFs, major hazard facilities. It's something that's probably not spoken about often, particularly in Tasmania, and I'll... Oh, thanks, mate. And I'll explain that. One of the slides will probably be obvious as to why. So that's our disclaimer. So regulation of MHFs in Tassie. We've adopted the model legislation. So Chapter 9 of the legislation of the regulations deals wholly and solely with major hazard facilities. And there's 4 schedules that support that. And Hugh brought up Schedule 16 in the previous presentation, which is the one for emergency response. So essentially this is pretty much the same regulation across the whole of Australia. So the big question is, what's an MHF? It's a facility that the regulator determines. And the regulator determines that based on 3 criteria. One is the quantity of specific chemicals that are stored or handled or used at the facility. And that's Schedule 15. Essentially, those chemicals are the highly toxic, the highly volatile, explosives and so forth. So the more dangerous chemicals within the community. And there's a threshold built in and around that. So there's a quantity. A site has to notify if they handle 10% of that aggregate quantity. So we've had about 60 plus sites notify when this legislation commenced in Tassie. Of those, we're down to about 8 MHFs. So not all sites are MHFs, because the next 2 factors are taken in consideration: what activities are undertaken and where's the facility located. So the activities could be warehousing, or the activity could be actually manufacturing the hazardous chemical. Very different, very big risks differences. And our role is the risk to Tasmania. So we're looking at what is the risk of the warehouse facility, particularly if it just warehouses one thing. If it's a warehouse for various chemicals, so it's a mixed dangerous goods warehouse, higher risk than just a simple storage for one particular chemical, potentially. So we look at the activity undertaken, and then we actually look at the facility location. Is it next to a school? Is it next to a shopping complex? Is it next to a retirement village? Or is it 50 kilometres away out in the verge of away from the city? So we look at the location of the facility. We look at all that together, and then there's a determination made whether or not the site's an MHF. There is another one that's up there, which is we actually have to look at the operator and determine whether or not the operator is a suitable operator. And that determination is based upon a declaration. And that declaration is made by the business plus every officer of the business. And that declaration is things like whether or not there have been any previous legal actions or anything like else that might have, or enforceable undertakings, or any of those sorts of things where we might look at it and say, well, hang on, this really is this the person we want to be operating a major hazard facility in the state, based on their history. So they're the things that we take in consideration for an MHF. Now these sites are licensed. They're the only workplaces that are actually licensed. So if they're not licensed, they don't operate. So every 5 years generally, although as a regulator we can reduce that period, every 5 years they have to reapply for a licence. So that's what Hugh does on a regular basis, because they've got a few MHFs with Origin, so there's a regular relicensing program for Origin throughout Australia. So where are our MHFs? Now these have been publicly gazetted, so I can let you know where they are. There's Orica up at Heybridge, Origin at Devonport, Downer EDI over Savage River, BOC at Westbury, the micro LNG plant there at Westbury, BCD Resources, which is the old Beaconsfield gold processing plant. It's still there and it's still licensed. Norske Skog, Nearstar and Origin, so at Sells Point. So Origin has 1/4 of our MHFs in the state, no pressure, Hugh. but there's a quarter of the MHFs there with LPG. So that's where they're located around the state. I'll get back actually. Every 5 years or every licensing period, they're required to provide a safety case to the regulator. Now that safety case summarises the process they go through to actually determine what their risks are, what controls are in place and how they're going to manage those controls. The safety case, generally I'll get one that's anywhere between probably 300 pages to about 800 pages in length, and that summarises basically what the business does, where it's located, what the geography is, the land use and everything around it, what Schedule 15 chemicals they have, what are the risks within their business, and then what's the management system they have in place to ensure the integrity of the controls. So that's, in a nutshell, what the safety case does. So that slide there is a bit more of an indication of what it's about. The first bit I've got underlined as a major incident. What you've got to realise is the major hazard facility is particular to the type of chemical, and the stuff we look at is particular to the major incidents that occur. So the major incidents are the ones that, like as Hugh was talking about, the bleve and those sorts of things, the ones that don't happen often but have a considerable impact. And those things that, I mean, the risks associated with some of them, or the probability of some of these, are in the millions of years. So we're looking at very low probability but quite a high consequence. And that's the scope of what we look at in the MHF side of things. Don't looking at the day-to-day risk stuff. So that's the major incident. They need to go through and look at identify what those are. So as Hugh said in his, what is the worst case scenario? What are the ones here that are going to cause a lot of impact? Then they look at the likelihood and consequences, assessments, look at what their preventative controls are, their existing mitigating controls, look at new controls, identify which ones are the critical ones, which are the showstoppers, which are going to prevent this happening. A lot of those are generally the engineering controls, whether or not it's a temperature gauge or a pressure gauge or something like that. They're the things that are going to be the critical ones. Administrative controls are quite often not reliable. They rely on us to do something. And as we've heard before, that in the heat of battle, that could go either way, and hit the wrong switch or flick the wrong thing or whatever. So it's engineering controls are by far the strongest ones and are more likely your criticals. The other thing is Hugh talked about, we did some modelling, he did some modelling there, so it's the area that's affected. That's important for the responders. Where might we need to consider evacuating? What part of this community will be affected? And performance indicators. There's a requirement to have performance indicators for every control. So what is its upper performance limit and what is its lowest performance limit? Make sure that we're tracking and monitoring that. So that's what happens on the safety assessment side of it. Then there's a management system which needs to support that. The MHF operators need to demonstrate how that links in. So there's things like governance, position descriptions and what you're actually responsible for. Asset management, procurement, contract management, change management, risk assessment, competencies, security, documents and records management, emergency plans and procedures, assurances, resources and community information. All that needs to be pulled together, it needs to be all integrated, and they need to demonstrate to us that they've gone so far as reasonably practicable. And there's a test for that in the legislation. So this safety case needs to pull all that together and to demonstrate that that's what they've done as an operator for an MHF. And based on that, whether or not the site will be licensed. As a regulator, we have the option to go back and ask for additional information if we're not happy, if they haven't demonstrated sufficiently or they haven't argued the point to for us to accept that they've gone as far as reasonably practicable, and we can ask as many times as we like before we licence the site. So what is our role as a regulator? We guide compliance and do a lot of that. The majority of our work is guiding compliance and having discussions. We have quite a few discussions. There are a suite of 9 guidance documents which are on Safe Work Australia's website. Now, they were developed in consultation with all the MHF regulators around Australia, so they're a bit dated now, and one of the things we have to do, probably following the the Work Health and Safety Reg reviews this year, is to go back and update those documents. But at the moment they're a guide. We monitor compliance. Every year we audit every MHF every year. And we drop in as well. If we're in the area driving off, auditing one MHF or something, we'll often drop in and see another one on the way through, just an unannounced visit. We decide on licences. As I said before, the licence is for the facility. Licences, because it's for the workplace, can be transferred to a new owner. It's not like a forklift licence or whatever which stays with the person. It's a licence to operate that particular facility. So if you want to transfer that, it's up to the person who owns it now to be able to demonstrate to us that the new owner can operate to the same level. It's not up to the new operator to demonstrate to us, it's up to the existing owner to apply for that transfer. A licence can be suspended, a licence can be cancelled, and a licence can be conditioned. We can place conditions on licences as well. All those things are reviewable, but they're all reviewable through court. The legislation allows for an internal review for general workplaces, which are done internally within our agency by probably another inspector or our management team. But any of these reviews for an MHF licence are through court. So we do that. That happens every year. We've got 8 MHFs, so at least one licence renewal every year. And that's a fairly lengthy process, a couple of months at least, working through that process. Take in consideration, you realise that's a 5-year licence, so we look at the outcomes of the last 5 years of audits, plus a safety case in that determination. And as a regulator, we have an assisting role in the Tasmanian Emergency Management Plan. Our role there is the prevention and mitigation of hazardous chemicals incidents. So we do that through the work that we do, the regulation of the legislation. We also have an assisting role, and that assisting role is for in emergencies such as, I think, Dunalley, we had people out in the field in regard to asbestos. If there was a major incident involving hazardous chemicals, we would certainly have an assisting role in that. So there are a lot of roles that we play as part of that emergency management plan. I sit on the Northern Committee up there. Probably have limited role, but that's a good thing because that's indicating that there's not a lot of incidents happening out there on the chemical side of things. So what do? We licence renewals, annual audits. Just to go look at what we've done from an annual audit perspective, we've done, the first year we did emergency management plans, and there was a reason for that. Essentially we wanted to make sure that they were up to par. That covers the whole right-hand side of a bow tie, if you know what a bow tie is. But we did that with the Tasmanian Fire Service. What they did was allow the Tasmanian Fire Services then in to see what the major industries were, the bigger players, the higher risk industry, and also allowed those industries to have a contact within that agency, which started that consultation process which is legally required. Having new legislation like the MHF legislation thrown at you is a bit daunting for some sites. someone like Origin and BOC and the bigger players had dealt with that interstate, because Queensland, Victoria and so forth started this legislation before we did. But there are other players in Tasmania, or other operators in Tasmania who didn't have that luxury. So having this cast at them was a bit daunting. So we started off with that emergency management side of things to start creating and initiating those contacts, but at the same time giving us assurance that there were processes in place, and then also out of that came improvements to that process. Second year we did asset management. As I said earlier, the biggest risks are the best controls, I should say, are our engineering controls. If your asset management system isn't functioning, you're going to struggle with the integrity of those controls. So that's why we attacked it the second year. So there's been we've had a plan, and we meet every year and plan on what we're doing and how we're going forward, and we'll plan 2 or 3 years or more in advance, and where we're heading with our audit program. I was asked once why we audit, given that I'm actually an inspector. I'm authorised as an inspector under the legislation. So why do we audit? The simple answer to that is the legislation says that the safety management system has to be the principal means of ensuring the safe operation of the facility. And it's a little bit, I can inspect a safety management system all day, that's fine, but you audit it is when you find out whether it's actually working or not. So that's why we audit, not inspect. Following that asset management side of things, we started being very selective on what we'll look at. If there was an area that we were concerned there was a weakness within the operator, we target that for that operator. Or we look at particular controls and target particular controls and drill right down. We look at it quite extensive. We drill quite deep. Who supplies it, what their manual is, what their inspection frequency is on it, what the specifications are, what have you currently got on place, on site. Look right down throughout the whole process. What is it? What are the upper and lower limits of the probe that you're using, or whatever else? Does your system operate within that? Are you calibrating it in and around the operating parameters? If you're calibrating it at 10 and 90 and you're operating around 40 to 50, what is it doing? Are you calibrating it around its operating parameters? So they're the things we look at. And this year and next year, the work health and safety legislation is being reviewed this year. For those that don't know, have a look on Safe Work website, Safe Work Australia website. I think the process commences this month or next month with public consultation. But the legislation here, the harmonised legislation, or the model legislation I should say, commenced in 2013 in Tasmania. And there were transitional legislation in place then, which meant that until sites were required to renew their licence, they could operate under their previous safety report under the rescinded legislation. So at the end of last year, all sites in Tasmania had to meet the current legislation, had to meet the current requirements for a safety case. So what we're doing this year is we'll be benchmarking where all sites sit against the current legislation. That'll allow us then to gauge where people are sitting and allow us to apply our resourcing appropriately. So risk managing it really. What is the biggest risk to Tasmania? Where are we going to put our resources? So that's our approach. Next year we'll be looking at the assurance side of it. Is your assurance system working? Your monitoring and your compliance side of it, within your self-assurance within your business. If that's not working, again, that'll give us an indication of where we need to apply our resources. But again, our role isn't just to assist, it's also to regulate. So those things have the potential to bring on some sort of warranted shove, nudge, or whatever you want to call it, to get those businesses to comply. Wrong way. Asked to talk about the issues. The issues are a little difficult because many of the issues are quite specific to a business, and I can't talk about those. They're with a particular business and they're particular things that we deal with that organisation. But MHFs are no different to any other workplace. The same things affect them. There is change management. The management of change within the organisation is one of the things that can bring on a lot of unwanted risk, I suppose. Operators, different manager will operate this facility differently. Most businesses, MHFs, dealt pretty well with engineering change, but did not deal well with organisational people change. And that's something that we've been addressing with all our MHF operators, because I don't think there was probably one that didn't do that well. But that's, I think, something common in all business. Other areas from our perspective too is there was a view that a large corporation would be able to manage this well because the systems and everything would be there. But what we've found is that businesses like Origin and BOC and the like, who have a lot of major hazard facilities, tend to have a core group who look after that and own it and manage it. But a lot of the other facilities that we've got, who might be part of a global business, a large corporate business, if you're an isolated MHF in Australia, not in Europe or somewhere else, it's that resourcing and that ability to draw on the knowledge within the business that is difficult for them. So they found that quite difficult. And there's just an expectation that, oh, you're part of a big corporation, so you'll have everything in place, and that's not the reality of things. So the issues are pretty much the same, as I was saying, but we drill a hell of a lot deeper and identify probably things that you as a business would never consider, but we do. The whole point of it is to close up every one of those little opportunities for that major incident to occur. To the Work Health and Safety Regulation Review, that's happening this year. I don't know what that's going to bring. I don't know if anyone knows what's it going to bring, but there might be some changes to the MHF side of things. There's obviously some changes to the European side after Buncefield, so that may impact on our schedule. I don't know. So there's a lot of things that that may change it. I know New Zealand's adopted the more recent Savesco schedule. Whether we as Australia adopt that, I don't know. That's a decision that's going to be made down the line. So I don't know if you want any questions. I know it's short and sweet, but it explains to you what it is, what an MHF is, what they're required to do, and what we do as regulators to ensure that, or as much as we can, the safe operation. You need about 70 million litres of fuel to be an MHF, and we haven't got one in Tasmania. I think our closest is not even half that. Again, it's the issue of its location and so forth, and fuel terminals. There's one right next door to Selfs Point, Origin terminal, again, but we have to make a decision whether or not. I don't think there might be one or two MHFs in Australia that actually don't meet the threshold. Most are over the threshold.